Okay, our next speaker is somewhat of an innovator. Having set up his own successful leadership consultancy, he then established Judgment Index UK, a fascinating way of assessing a person's capacity for good judgment. He's brought his highly complex and mathematical theories and applied them to many a sporting institution with great success. Please welcome Rob Coulthard.
Hello.
Mic, Rob, and just if we can just finish by 1:45, that would be great.
Yeah. Is that on? We're on. Thank you, Rebecca. Delighted to be here, thank you. And quite apt that George, my background was, you'll see it in the bio, but colourful military career and did everything I wanted to do really in the military. But one of the first people I ever met as a 16-year-old arriving at junior leaders was George, surprisingly enough. And it is, although it is a small community, and he scared me a bit because we thought he was a man. He wasn't a man, he was only 17 himself, but he was our junior sergeant. He'd give me hell, particularly when I sidestepped him a number of times in the rugby park in the coming weeks. What I'd like to share with you is the concept of value-based judgments and how they can impact and interact with business and both sport and some of the things we're doing. Just the expectations, really, when I will discuss the material and the metrics we use in slide, but there is a massive amount of theory behind it. So please, I'm not going to go into the science and research too much and the metrics. I just want to perhaps describe how we're using the material in both a commercial sense, where its origins were from, and how we're using it in sport now and how you might, benefit and look at what we do. So judgments, an interesting topic, and if we think in the last sort of 3 years in society, what an impact the word judgment has had in certain spheres, we've only got to look at, and normally it's through bad press, and when we look at judgments, well, let's think of some of the disasters that happened recently, where the big quote in the paper has been bad judgment. Well, politicians were a good starter for 10. Not that they didn't have the experience and knowledge to make good judgments, but there was quite a faux pas on their behalf from a judgment capacity. The other area is what's probably affected all of us with business in this recent few years has been bankers and poor judgment from the banking community over the last few years have had catastrophe all around. And again, not that they didn't have the knowledge, the skill, the experience, the ability to make good decisions, interact with society and the world and create good judgment, but let's say a few mistakes along the way. And probably social workers is always a good one because they've got more qualifications you can shake a stick at, and yet on a number of occasions have failed to make the right judgment, and it's cost dearly people. A couple of slides where you might be thinking now, is that good judgment or bad judgment? The young fella on the left hand side, well, I'm not the best at DIY, but that's probably not a great judgment call for welding with a newspaper as a guard on his face. You might look at the guy doing his mono skiing there and think, is that a good judgment? Well, if he's an expert mono glider, mono skier, and this is a competition where he can nail a jump and win, it's probably a good judgment. If it was me or you who thought, oh, we'll have a crack, let's set me up the ramp when we go on that whizzy thing that drags you around, it's probably a bad one. So it highlights the difference. What I want to share with you is this link between how values can probably and can have a big effect on predicting performance, and share with you some of the stuff we're doing. Thanks, Neil. So, this little link, I'll come on to where the Judgment Index came from, and it's based on the Hartman Value Profile and some of the work that I'll do, and I'll go on to that in a second. But let's just look at this link between your values, where they've come from, where they've formed, and how they can have an impact on your performance and potentially predict performance. And also how your values and your judgments can be massive barriers to performing at an elite level, and that's really what we want to get to. So think of where your values came from. So where did they come from? Well, when you squirted out your mother's womb and as a wee ball of screaming, what's it? You'd have to say, to what extent did you have values built in that were going to be developed? Well, I like to think there's a nurture-nature argument, and And that argument from a performance, Professor Dave will have a good discussion if you needed to discuss it in more depth than that. The nature-nurture around values and performance and prediction, but also attitudes as well. Let's think about what you might have been like and just reflect. And as we're going through this morning now, perhaps you might reflect on how your values have shifted and how they've affected performance. So everything I threw up there, perhaps put into the context of where you sit or where the people around you sit. When you were 15 or 16, think of the values you had and how they impacted on you making judgment calls with both, not just decision making, but with interaction with people, with work ethic, with how you thought, with stress mechanisms, with coping mechanisms. And let's think about them as you shifted. I know plenty of guys who were lunatics as kids and actually grew up to be fairly sensible businessmen. We might have one or two in here. But I also know plenty of grumpy old men who were fairly cool as teenagers. George, in fact, he was... No, I'm teasing, mate. So your values do shift. And when we get into a situation, and let's say the impact on what you do now. You get into a situation, whatever it might be, and that situation you're thrust into, you'll evaluate, and you'll typically, even at an unconscious level, will drift back into decision-making and strategies, but how you're going to deal with that situation. And this evaluation process will then lead you on to making a decision and making a judgment about how you either interact, go about what you're going to do, or the situation. Once you've made that decision, you'll tend to get a result. So we can see this link from the situation and to what impact that has on your value system will start to shape how you decide, interact and make judgments about the situation, how you might perform. And ultimately, once you've performed, you'll probably review and reflect, which again will shape your judgment and your value of a situation, which we know can change. The beauty about the material, I think, and we'll come on to it, is that values do shift. So looking at this material in a form of a development tool was really exciting for me, for someone who develops from a coaching perspective. You know, we're not fixing people in a certain way. Thank you. So the originator, Hartmann, Robert Hartmann, German, won't go into it too much, but he fled Hitler's regime in the 30s, and he was just really, if you can click that on please, Neil. Yeah, just whack him up. So, no, back a bit. So Hartmann fled Hitler. He was perplexed all his life that he'd seen this evil tyranny. He'd seen evil organised so effectively, and if you could do it with evil, you could do it with good. But the base behind it was, how could you organise good to such effect? Well, values was the thing. And if you could understand and measure someone's values, perhaps you could have a chance of organising good. And he set about trying to create a matrix that would put an analytic measurement around a value system. Hartmann ended up in the USA, was Walt Disney's right-hand man and mentor for many years, and then left that sort of period of his life to go back to studies and came up with a Hartmann value profile. He died in 73, and he was nominated a Nobel Prize, and his let's say, understudy, Dr. Steve Byron, carried on his work, and Steve's probably one of the world leads in this subject who I work with directly in the States. Thank you. So, that was the background of it. Let's see what it is. We know it's based on the Hartmann value profile, and it's basically Byron's interpretation of the material. And what we're going to assess, we're trying to look at how important these things are to performance and your sport in this context. So to what extent, if we can measure someone's people skills, task ability, strategic capacity, wellness, stability, and consistency of how people make judgments, it will be really, really important. And if we can do that accurately, which we believe over 40 years of work and research, looking at performers in different aspects, knowing who will perform in what way, we think we're pretty sharp. It's never a crystal ball, and it never is, but it will give us some ideas and some edge to be able to understand how somebody may perform. It's very accurate on predicting risk We do quite a lot of work on predicting risk. I'm quite successful looking at officer cadets going through Sandhurst and predicting the % failure rate from some underlying elements. We also look up, yeah, please flick on. So we can look at job and cultural fit. The reason it's quite flexible is because we have values. Everyone in every job's got values, and they've got benchmark values. So the fact that the material can flex between different environments is quite unique as well. It makes it interesting for me, because I can step into the corporate and business world, but I also play a lot with the military still and go and do a lot of work with them. But again, I get them great opportunities going back to my roots as a, you know, an ex-athlete. I know I'd be shot if I was a greyhound now, but going back and stepping into the environment with sportsmen is very, very exciting for me. So cultural and job fit is interesting. And interesting as well, where somebody can be great with one team and fit in really well because they've got similar values and traits, but then step into another team and perhaps not fit in too well. And it's an interesting one where somebody's value system and how they operate and interact can be subtly different and work with one organisation and not with another. And maybe if we can start to benchmark the quality and value traits of one organisation best performers, we can then start to map against other areas that we can fit people against. Thank you. We said it's environmentally friendly. Thank you. Yep. So what is it? Online, 20-minute system. It used to be done on paper years ago, but it's an online assessment. You do it on 20 minutes. There's no time limit. And it's a simple bank of statements that you adjust and prioritise in your own way. Very abstract in its makeup. Unlike some psychometrics, some of you highly trained the psychologists in here will probably be able to train you to get a certain score on a Myers-Briggs or whatever. I defy you to be able to understand how to get a result off this. It's just too complicated. And there's about 12 trillion outcomes. The math behind it blows me away. The math paper, I'll be delighted to send it to anyone for a read. Some in here will probably like to look at it, but it defies the ability to be able to predict what you will get from it. Thank you. Yeah. And okay. So, and again, it's very abstract in the statements. You wouldn't understand. So what it's not. Critical, and what we're not claiming to be able to do. Not an IQ test. Not a measure of knowledge and skills of what you've done. I say skills, I'll caveat that, because I get a pretty good feeling for people's interaction and people's skills, or people's work ethic, or the trainability areas, which I'll come on to in a second, what we've been doing, working with England Golf. I'll come on to looking at those skill elements, but basically giving you somebody who's going to do a 35-yard pass off his left hand, I'm not going to give you that stuff. Neither is it a personality profile. So we're not going to fix someone as a personality. And again, we're very useful with teams and working in areas, and you know, it's great when you use the material that works with your people. We're not going to claim to be able to tell people's personalities. I'll give someone an edge who's going to be a people-orientated person, or a task-driven, or a very strategic, analytical thinker, but not really from a character perspective in that respect. So there will be the limitations on what we'll do. Interestingly, we did use it with elements of a psychometric with Paul Azinger's Ryder Cup squad. Their last successful Ryder Cup squad used the material to look at the dynamics of pairings. Last time they were successful, actually, which we liked. Corey Pavin didn't choose to use the material, which is always good for us. Probably good for Europe Golf as well. Thank you. So what do organisations want? And we'll flick through these, and I'll keep off the military stuff, but that was a half marathon in Bosnia, and I was out there some time ago in a past life, enjoying myself, going in one direction. But if we can just flick through these, think about what you want from your organisation, from the people you employ or the people you sign. Well, you pretty much want good signings, goal-focused, committed, work ethics, reduced risk. And how do you get that currently? From a team member, what do you want of your teammates? What are you looking for in the type of people you want to work with? And how do you recognise that? So let's just, you want to move on, please, Neil. So looking at the team people, this is actually an interesting one. This was the photographs, as just flashed them up, Neil, was the guys on the boat there are the disabled servicemen who 2 weekends together on a boat won the Cows Fastnet, beat all the military 30 boats who were all supposed to be seasoned veteran sailors, and they whooped them after 2 weekends together, which was fantastic. They're all limbless or injured. The Navy team here was an interesting one where I think this is the Navy team after they beat the Army first time in 10 years at Twickenham, which I was shamefully invited to go and work with, and I did offer it the Army, but they said they were pretty much sorted. So the Navy, as I'd done a lot of work with the Marines and Naval Leadership Academy, I went in, did some work profiling. Dave loves this because Professor Dave was an ex-Marine, so he'll enjoy this. So I've been invited to go and work with the Navy rugby team, profile them, do some leadership work with the spine key players on the team, and some state. They beat the Army first time in 10 years, which was quite a victory. But I was sat in amongst 150 paras, getting a bit of a hard time when they won. But that's bar the bar. So how do you identify this person? What do you do currently when you're identifying people, the type of people you want? Well, you've got a mixture of a barrage of assessments and tests. Please just flick through these, Neil. So you look at previous job, you look at CVs. How many people have you ever interviewed and 6 months later went, who the heck was that? You know, that wasn't the person on the CV. How many people get promoted or written up for jobs just because you want to get rid of them, basically? And that happens all too frequently. What we try and do is cut under the skin of someone and look behind the mask. And that's what sometimes get into someone's value system and how they're going to make judgments and interact with the world is going to give you. And it's sometimes very subtle in how you might do that. So, maybe that is an option. If you can flick on this. So what can we measure? So I'm going to flash up now a basic score sheet. Oh, have you got the laser, please, Andrew? And we'll judge then. I'll just whiz through some of these areas. And what I'd like you to do, is perhaps try and identify areas. Sorry, it might be a bit distant for some of you. Identify areas that we measure. Each one of these indicators down here, there is a range and a score. And the ranges are different. I've purposely left them out because they would confuse because they're different ranges. But I'll benchmark them against performers for you in a second. So the key elements about this areas we're going to measure will be people skills, task process, and strategic ability. Now, think of the importance of those things with your sport. Now, some of them, for instance, the people skill element, I tend to take it out for the golfers. Why? Because they tend to be lone animals, very self-driven, and some of the people skills with many of them are poor, but they don't need it. You know, they don't need it for being a #1 golfer, perhaps. So I'm not saying that they're all poor people, skilled people, but it's perhaps a less important factor if we look at a capability framework. George mentioned earlier about jobs, really the job spec and the analysis. I'm looking at the capabilities required to perform in that environment. So these are the type of areas we measure, and we're looking at the sensitivity of someone, the noticing skills. From the golfer's respect, this is somebody who will be able to read a course, pick up the environmental issues and be able to spot those. Trainability, these first few here are all around the conceptual ability of someone. Can they make the picture in the head? Interestingly, we're looking at tolerance and acceptance of people. And it'd be interesting to see how many people are great performers and sportsmen or military operators in the field may come back from Afghanistan with the MC or whatever else, and then they're typically stuck into Sandhurst or go into a training role where they're not potentially ideal for training. They're great on ops, but they shouldn't be training. Or the sportsman who's great on the field, but has poor communication or coaching ability. And you'll have seen it all the time. Some of the scores and some of the things we measure don't really impact as much on the job, and some will. So again, it's role dependent on where we might use some of these scores. You'll see some of them are pretty much just written in. So it doesn't matter, there's no right and wrong on it, it's just your orientation as a person. That's an interesting one, this person's moderately realistic. I'm highly idealistic in my approach to life. Changed slightly, I've got a little more balanced, but I'm highly idealistic. Interesting, my wife is highly realistic. We wonder why I've been fighting for 20 years. And it tends to be a nice pointer for team clash. So using some of these indicators to look at team cohesion is really interesting when I can pick out who's likely going to clash in a team. Working with the Navy rugby team, told by the coach, the director, that one of the guys was always, he had more fights with the team, his own team in the changing room than he did tend to off the park, on the park. This guy was highly sensitive to the point where he was oversensitive and over-personalised issues. He was a very quick thinker, very lateral in his thinking, and he didn't have many coping strategies in stress scenarios. So he tended to flash a little bit, which was, you didn't want this 18-stone monster coming at you on the best of days. So it created problems within the group. But we helped him sort this out. Could you just scroll down there, Neil, please? So the working environment, that working part, is pretty much about the external world we operate in. And some indicators will be far more important than others. Interestingly, if you just come down one nudge on that, mate. No, sorry, down a bit. You can see this... no, just down. Carry on, come in. No, so the other way. I don't know me ups for me. Oh! Ups for me downs, do I? So apart from looking at things like strategic ability, focusing, concentration levels, the ability to follow directions, the stress indicators are an interesting area. In the working world, this stress indicator often relates to somebody's overload and their ability to cope in that environment. In the self world, down here, this person you'll see is highly stressed. Typically relates to their own life, what's going on. I'm picking out young servicemen. I'm working a lot with servicemen transitioning from military to civilian world. And their ability to cope and the stress and trauma that some of them have got is quite horrendous. You'd be surprised how many are ending up on the streets or in prison. But picking out guys with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety levels is quite evident. Interestingly, it's a similar combination I'm finding with young golfers and young teenagers who are coming through. The coping strategies of a young person and then looking at that as a foundation to operate, perform, train and develop off is somebody sat on a wobbly foundation for performance. They might pull off the odd event, but they'll be inconsistent. So this is quite an interesting one. In these parts 1 and 2, I tend to talk about the capacity for genius, or if it's not going right at the time. At the bottom here, we tend to start looking at people's ability, how they actually value things in this current climate. So they either overvalue or undervalue. So for instance, you could have had fantastic people skills up there, and this person was reasonable. Down here, he's got quite an undervalue of people right now. So currently, this person is undervaluing the people around him. And again, having worked with a few golfers, worked with one particular golfer, she had a fantastic people skills, but her value of people right now was not good. And when questioned, she said, "What do you mean? I'm great with people 1 minute, and now you say I'm undervaluing people." I said, "Well, you are." And she said, "Well, have you seen those what's-its I've got to work with?" So it tends to stem from it. Another interesting one is the value of your tasks and work right now. Not to say that you've not got great capacity and great work ethic, but there might be an undervalue of what you're doing. The athlete and the performer who's getting overloaded or getting stressed or actually not getting challenged. The default for me on this one is always the stress indicator in work. So, for instance, the person here is coping with the stresses of work, but if this was a -15, you can see the sweet spot where we want to be, plus or minus 15. I'd know they were undervaluing their tasks, what they were doing. The number of people I sit down with and say, "Are you looking for another job?" And they go, "Whoa, who have you been talking to?" Going in with UK Sport, doing some profiling with people to go on a fast-track manager's course. Probably 8 of the 10 profiled massively undervalued what they were doing. They didn't have any stress. They weren't getting challenged. That was basically it. So they're either going to walk or they needed to challenge them and bring life into their work. These balance of ideas is an interesting one for a sportsman. If you've got an overvalue of ideas, this tends to tell me somebody who's been a little over-analytical and a little paralysis by analysis almost. So the golfers is quite interesting, where they're overthinking the shot. Undervalue that, you tend to leap before you look. So there's a range of things, and you can see from a self-esteem perspective, a simple combination of these, because I see this as an X-ray really, is somebody who may be highly motivated, but highly self-critical, that then has an impact on self-esteem. And then we know what this might happen to the performance of someone. Could you just flick along? I know I'm busting the clock here, but we'll just go along a bit, please, mate. Now, just jump that. The report design, yeah, that'll be great. The report design, when we put reports together, you'll see from that last slide, we wouldn't use all the indicators. So we tend to look at capabilities of a job or a role and then cluster indicators around that role to get very finite on what the role might be. So this report was something I've done with a selection of the England regional golfers, 14s to 16-year-olds, to see who's going to progress through. And we created a report based on discussion with some of the EGU staff and other people to look at 3 real component areas. And this will probably transpire into different environments and jobs. 1, wellness and coping of the person. If you sat on a wobbly foundation, you typically won't train effectively or compete effectively. They might do, but they might not. So it allows the coach and the team to discuss. Quite often it will be things in the background and stresses that you don't know about. Trainability. Somebody who has barriers. Now this little collection stems from work we're doing in the Mayo Clinic, identifying barriers to people rehabilitating and trying to identify where people are going to get stuck in their rehab program. But if you can identify those early on in a rehab program, you can quite often unlock them. But it's no different than having a graduate on a MS, on a course or a program, or somebody in an academy coming forward. If you've got barriers to progression and development and you can unlock that, well, that's going to be useful information. If you could just scroll it down a touch. And then this last area is pretty much looking at what I call a competition judgment, looking at the things that you need to be sharp. And so from the golfing perspective, we need people who have got strong noticing skills environmentally, people who can strategically plan and think quick, people who will be focused, and again, people who will have balance of thought and action, not be caught up in paralysis by analysis or leap before they look. I think that's pretty much summarising it. We're not going to jump through too many more slides. I don't think we'll jump through any more slides, really, because I'm conscious of time. But pretty much to summarise this, we are taking the value, we put in a matrix around a judgment capacity. And judgment, obviously, I've explained, is far more than just making decisions. Your judgment about how you interact with people, life, the world. We're taking that matrix and that measurement, and we've got those measurements by looking at best performers in different environments over 40 years. And then being able to transfer that onto a report and some material that's benchmarked against your best performers or the capabilities required for that job. And then coming up with some fairly accurate ability to predict performance, but also looking at barriers and risk within an organisation and a team. Thank you. I think that will about do for me. Myself and Sophie, we're going to be around all day. There is a flyer in your folder. Delighted to share all our research and further work with you. There is a lot more required in the sport environment. We've got tons in the commercial sector. We're getting there with the sport. I'm doing a lot of work with the RFU, with their management selections, and more needed. So if people want to engage with us, we'd be delighted to. Thank you.